we can or need to on today's conversation. I do want to just, as I do at the start of all of these meetings, and I know at times it seems odd because you can see everybody who's on the call, but we do also have some folks watching the live YouTube stream or watching after the fact. So just a few norms that I'm going to ask everybody to follow. One is to minimize and in fact avoid use of the chat unless absolutely critical. If you need to send me a direct message or Carrie, feel free to do so. But otherwise, we want to keep the conversation on screen. My other ask will be that when you speak, if you would at least introduce yourself by first name, so anybody who can't see the tiny print on the screen or maybe just listening to the audio knows who is speaking. With that, let me kind of lay the groundwork for today's call. I know everybody got the agenda. We had what I thought was frankly one of the most complex, at times confusing, and at times inspiring calls last time as we tried to address what is this simple issue we're trying to solve of ensuring every Coloradan with any disability has access to affordable and accessible housing. And you helped us identify a lot of the complexities in that. The steps that we're taking are to start acting on getting a lot of the information that you all identified. We have a call scheduled later this week with the state demographer. So at one point today, we will spend some time really digging into what type of data would be most useful. I've also got some conversations scheduled with the Department of Housing under the Department of Local Affairs. So we're going to start looking into what the State Department of Housing has in terms of research or data and where we may need to be probing more at the local level on local housing authorities. But before we go there, since last week or last month when we were together wasn't complex enough, today we're going to tackle the simple issue of making sure we have financing to make all of this affordable. And for those not watching, just listening, yes, you are seeing me smirk a little bit. We've got some tough issues to dig into, but I'm trusting this group can help us get through that. So we'll spend some time talking about what does it mean and how do we interpret the charge we've been given, which is we're supposed to address recommendations for financing for low-income housing development, among our other charges, which include ensuring that we address barriers to enjoying secure and affordable, attainable housing, which I know we talked about last time can mean a lot of different things, whether we're talking about rental property, purchased property, whether we're talking about one-bedroom homes, condos, or multifamily units or single family homes. What I want to do though is kind of ground us back to our last conversation. And I know it's been a few weeks, but I want to go around and just ask everybody, what, if anything, were your big takeaways? Whether it was something you learned, whether it was an aha moment, something that really stood out to you, or if there isn't anything jumping out to you from that conversation since it's been a few weeks, what's been on your mind coming into today's call when we start talking about the issues we have to address, which, just to ground us in that, the purpose of this subcommittee is to identify barriers to securing and enjoying secure and affordable, accessible, and attainable housing for persons with disabilities and to make recommendations for addressing those barriers. Paul, I'm going to go to you first and then to Cassidy. Would love just what thoughts you walked away from our last conversation with or you're coming into today's call with.
Paul Gansudik. I don't know if anything was really lingering from last call. Maybe something that's been on my mind is the Colorado Model Energy Code has been impacting us a lot, and it's a less than a year published, I believe, and just all the unforeseen impacts that code has had on the way we do things, and kind of the sobering reality that brings on to maybe our charge here, and if stuff comes out from this, trying to be aware that it's going to have far-reaching impacts.
Paul, if I could probe a little bit on that. For those who haven't been part of either code board and code development or aren't living with the effects in particular of the Model Energy Code, what does that look like? When you talk about some of the unexpected, how is that playing
out? Gosh, there's so much. So on one end, some of the data contained within that. Well, first, I guess just where it's published. Designers go to the international codes to design their projects. And that wasn't an appendix to that. That's a separate document, as is, historically Title IX, the accessibility thing. And so without, an email coming in, just access to those codes for all the professionals out there, it's caught a lot of people unprepared. Maybe another part of it is the implementation window. In the Model Energy Code, there's provisions requiring certain numbers of EV charging spaces and sunset dates that require those to be incorporated. Generally within, let's call it a 6 to 12 month window. Most of the projects we work on are a 4 or 5 year window to get through development. And so we have projects that we're near completion that aren't going to meet that, those grandfather provisions, et cetera. Dimensions for an electric vehicle charging space are actually larger. So it's physically changing the design of buildings, as could, access provisions as well. But those buildings, they were designed years ago, and the design impact changes are 6 figures, and it's causing additional delays on these projects. So I don't know. Those are 2 examples, I guess.
No, I appreciate that, and I didn't intend to put you on the spot, but I thought it was important for folks to all hear, and whether it's the group on here or those watching, that something that seems pretty removed from what we're talking about actually can have some direct intersection with it. So I appreciate you sharing some examples. Cassidy, to you, and then to Anais.
All right, Cassidy Roberts from Disability Law Colorado. Yeah, I guess a reflection from last time is I think I was just really surprised by how complex our conversation was, specifically regarding the inventory question, and how many different variations, I guess, of an accessible home, and what does it mean to have accessible homes in every community, in every part of the state, serving people in a variety of ways. So I thought that was surprisingly complex, and I'm glad we had that discussion. And then for today, I'm just excited to hear from folks who are in the affordable housing space. I don't have a ton of experience in that area, so I'm curious to hear from others.
Thank you. Anais, and then Rochelle.
Yeah, I will echo Cassidy's statement about how complex it is, and really how our different perspectives around affordability really have to kind of, be in tune, and how do we encompass all of that complexity within a group has been fascinating to wreck with in my brain. And so, that was one of the main takeaways I had from our last meeting, is just acknowledging again how complex this is, acknowledging how many of the people I serve are commonly excluded in the conversation, and really just understanding the state of the situation here. And also really looking forward to hearing from those in the affordable housing group when it comes to financing and how they really have to structure those things, so to open up my perspective a little bit. So I'm just so thankful of the wide perspectives that we have, because it's, even though it's adding complexity, it's also adding knowledge, and it's allowing me to understand things a little better.
I appreciate that. Rochelle, and then Shelley. And I'm not sure, we've got somebody on by phone. If that is somebody who's a member, I will get to you next. If not, appreciate you being on the line with us. Rochelle, and then Shelley.
Hi, everybody. Rochelle Mitchell. I was unable to attend the last meeting. I was in an audit for Grand Junction Center for Independent Living. And so I did actually have a chance to go over the notes, and was surprised yet not surprised about the discussion around the about inventory. I also serve on the 307 ordinance committee for the sidewalks for Denver here, and just trying to get a handle on units of housing within the city of Denver and how much sidewalk is in front of them is like this insurmountable task. It feels like that we've been working on for like 8 months, and so the nuances that are surrounding this are even so much more complex. And plus, in independent living, we really try to make it available that all housing should be somewhat accessible, as whether or not it's affordable or should be allowable to use a Section 8 voucher and things like that. So even the definitions around it aren't really clear or aren't really commonly used or agreed upon. And so I think that the basis of this group will be really well served if we can just have some common language around some of those things and understand what we're trying to chase within that realm. If that makes any sense, I think that would probably help out.
It does make sense, and I appreciate that. Shelley, your thoughts?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Shelley Marquez. For me, I would echo some of the same comments that were made, but for me, it's kind of when I think about the work of this task force and trying to assess what is when we talk about accessible housing, not having a baseline of what's out there. And I guess after our last meeting, I walked away thinking, isn't that something CHAFA could provide, especially from a low-income housing tax credit perspective? Each developer, so many of their units are going to have an accessibility requirement to it. And is there a way that, because it would be nice when I think about what is that end narrative of this committee, it would be that we've learned that here's what the inventory looks like, but here's what the need is beyond that. So being able to match it up. So the data, I really want to learn more about that. But I think just I was a little, the inventory was one. And then the other thing that really stood out was we can build it, but if they don't have access to it, it's almost like you're isolating individuals in developments that has accessibility, but it doesn't give them access to the broader community or, down the street, whatever that may look like. So it's much more complex.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Shelley. If that phone number is a member of the subcommittee, you're welcome to come off mute and jump in. If not, this will be the last time I call on you, unless you're a member of the public and want to jump in when we get to the conversation. Just as kind of a pivot point so everybody is aware, as I said at the top, we've got a call set up with the state demographer. Literally, as we are talking, I just got pages and pages of data, which Shelley, you may love digging into, and we'll start sharing this with some folks. The data that I just got in is about the numbers of Coloradans with disabilities broken down by county in general. And then we've got some data breaking down by age group and by type of disability, as well as we've got some racial and ethnic breakdowns. But I'll share this a little bit later. I'll just give an overview and then we'll get all this cleaned up into you. But it also shares information like how many statewide are we talking about with a hearing disability, with a vision disability, cognitive, ambulatory, self-care, or independent living, as well as the age breakdowns across some of these. And when I share this, you'll see that statewide, the data from the American Community Survey says that 10.8% of Coloradans identify as living with a disability. When we look across the state, there's some big fluctuations from a low point of 4.3% of residents self-identifying as living with a disability in San Juan County, up to in Los Alamos, we're talking about 23.4%. So I think just underscoring our conversation a month ago that there really isn't one thing we can apply and say, this fits statewide. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole just yet. Shelley, we will be getting with CHAFA and see what they can get us on some of these numbers. As you might imagine, we are chasing a dozen different sources of data, and not everybody gets back to us quite on the schedule that we would like, but we know they're busy doing their daily work. So we're going to continue to aggregate all of that. As I said, today we want to talk about the funding. And I know I keep reading this and rereading it, but I want to make sure everybody is clear on the scope of inquiry and what we're asked to do. In addition to that language describing our purpose of identifying barriers to securing and enjoying affordable, accessible, and attainable housing, we're supposed to make recommendations by December 1st. And the one I want to focus on today is, yes, we're going to address what the current need is, what the future projected need is, what the inventory is, with all those complexities we've all just discussed. But one of the pieces is making recommendations to meet future housing demand, including financing for low-income housing. So that's where I want to spend some time today. And I think we should, when the language here is pretty specific, that it's financing for low-income housing development, which, as I read that and checked with a few folks, that doesn't mean we're talking about financing for purchase. We're talking about financing for the affordable housing development. Now, that can look like a lot of different things. And Shelley, I'm going to get you in here first on this. That could mean the development of multi-parcel, multi-unit development spanning city blocks where they may be doing some redevelopment. It could be the development of single multi-unit development of one condo building or one apartment building. Maybe it's a housing development itself. So I want us to think pretty broadly about what a housing development could mean, but we're talking about the financing for low-income housing. And Shelley, I'm going to ask you to lean in here first with, we don't control banks, but one thing I want to point out is we're not just here to make recommendations for changes to law. That is certainly in our purview. We can make recommendations that the law should require X, Y, or Z. We may also make recommendations that municipalities, counties, or cities include in their approval processes, different things. We may make recommendations and ask that our local finance institutions or our private sector partners engage in certain best practices. And I'm putting all this up there because I want us to think as broadly as possible about what an affordable housing development could be, and as broadly as possible about what some ideas could be. And Shelley, I'll open it up to you first. And I'm curious, what comes to mind for you when somebody says financing for low-income housing development? What's out there, and what are some of the complexities to it generally before we even dig into making sure this is accessible?
Sure. So when I hear low-income housing or low-income housing financing, there's a couple of things that come to mind. So Mercy is a affordable housing developer, and when we think about low income, we develop low income housing financing, and the way to be able to do multifamily development. So that's what I think about. It's multifamily development. It could be 30 units, it could be 200 units, but it's multifamily development. And most of that financing comes from federal, state, and local subsidies. So that does require the use of a federal or the low-income housing tax credits. That is the main financing source when I think about low-income financing, because you need subsidy to be able to manage rents, to keep those rents down. And so the low-income housing tax credits, 9%, 4%, state tax credits, they allow a developer to keep the rents low for someone that is in a below 80% of area median income. That's usually the range that you have to stay in when you're utilizing a low-income housing tax credit resource or subsidy.
I appreciate you breaking it down to easy language for all of us. Brian, welcome. What you missed was me really getting us focused today on the piece of our work that relates to making recommendation for financing or addressing barriers for financing for low-income housing development. Shelley, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, and then I want to bring everybody else in. And Rochelle, I'll just tee up. I'm going to go to you next, and I expect a lot of our members are probably going to have questions for some of our folks in this space. Shelley, if you could wave a wand and improve the conditions of some of these incentives and these subsidies, what do you think would be the most effective levers to spur more development and to do so statewide in more than our most dense or high cost communities?
So I think there's a couple of things, and it really is at the federal level right now. And it's lowering the rate of tax credits from 50, lowering that test from 50 to, I think what's in front of the Congress right now is lowering it to 30%. So the challenge for most developers right now is it's very competitive when you apply for tax credits, whether it's a 4% tax credit or a 9% tax credit. They're oversubscribed 3-to-1 is what CHAPA shared recently at the CHAPA Housing Summit. So the example I would give you, their last round of tax credit applications, there were over 31 applications and 9 developers were selected. So there are opportunities. There are developers, for-profit, nonprofit, that want to do more in this space, but there's limited tax credit resources. And not only tax credit resources, but private activity bonds. So ideally, if I wave the wand, the passing of the legislation would happen, the tax credit legislation, that would free up or open up the market to make more availability of tax credits for developers to really be able to go after. But it brings the other side to that is when you have more availability, the pricing for those tax credits are going to go down, and that can impact the development, the needs for that particular development. So there are so many different issues, but I do know there's something at the state right in legislation to bring additional state tax credits. And I'm looking at Brian on the screen because he could talk about what that, how that could open up the door for additional opportunities in development.
I love that pivot and handoff. And Brian, I am going to bring you in because assuming that you all can't help us write the perfect report that brings peace and cooperation to Washington, D.C., what are we going to do here in Colorado to make things happen anyway? And what are you seeing or have you seen or would like to see?
Yeah, so one of the bright spots in our financing here in Colorado is that we do have a state credit for building affordable housing. Currently it's $10 million. There's going to be a proposal to increase that, to double it to 20 million, which is a really important tool to the development of housing. It's paired right now with the 4% credits. This expansion would pair it with the 9% credits, which just makes it just makes everything go further. So that's our best tool on the state level, because our budget is just so screwy, and it's there's not a whole lot of room for cash investment and cash infusion beyond what we have. And we've got great resources in terms of our vendor fee revenue and our housing development grant fund, which is funded by that. So there's bright spots in Colorado. The trick is how to get creative with these resources that we might be able to tap into, given that our budget can't grow at a significant rate because of Tabor. So I think those are a couple things I'd mention, kind of hopping off on what Shelley was saying, and in the hope for the federal legislation, if the Senate signs off, that decrease in the bond threshold, it's super geeky and it takes a lot of explaining on how it works, but it opens up a tremendous amount of capacity for the federal low-income housing tax credit to work in our state.
I appreciate the complexity of it, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole. Brian, I am going to ask you, and I don't want to put you on the spot for very specific numbers, but we talk about going from 10 million to 20 million. We talk about what if the Senate plays well and passes things. We're talking dollars and percentages.
Mhm.
Can you help this group understand and put our arms around what that looks like for units? When we talk about a $10 million available pool that might go to 20 million, we're also talking about the average price of a home in Colorado, pushing 600,000. And I know we're not talking about paying for it, but just to get our arms around the type of effect that going from 10 million to 20 million in Colorado or the federal adjustment could make. How should we be thinking about units that could help bring online or could incent developers to dive in on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have those numbers right at hand, but it's certainly something that I can get easily from my colleagues at Chaffa, in terms of like what that does in terms of unit production. My sense is that the federal adjustments will make a bigger difference, because the new expansion of the tax credit is going to be paired with some existing resources. And so it's not going, it's not going to double the amount of units that could be created under the state credit, but it's going to increase it by a significant portion. But I can get those numbers.
Yeah, and Barrick, I have some of the numbers that were shared at the Chaffa Housing Summit that I'm more than willing to pull up the screen if you're okay with that, to share some of the slides on data that was provided.
I am. Let me make sure that do you have screen shareability? Under share screen. This is what happens when I ask questions without doing any prep of people or myself ahead of time.
Barrick, I think I just changed the settings so anyone can share, not just hosts.
Thank you.
Right. So this is just an example of what was shared at the Housing Summit last week. And so when we talk about this federal legislation and lowering the 50% test down to 25, what does that mean? It's 1.1 million homes. And this is Novogradic's estimates of additional affordable rental homes over 10 years. So increasing the 9% allocation, it means 232,000 homes. And this is nationally, implementing the 30% basis boost. Again, what that does for an increase of homes, and then implementing the 50% boost again is 110,000 homes. So it was pretty telling that this the passing of this particular bill at the federal level could have a tremendous impact, not only for nationally, but locally. And I'll go through some of the slides to see if there's anything I can share that would give us what does that look like for Colorado, because they did break it down. And here it is. I didn't wanted to make sure I can. So this gives you so here are markets when we talk about undersubscribed or lowering the test from 50 to 30%, because that's what's on the table. Here's from 2024 to 2025, it'll be 186,310 units. And then that number jumps up to over 850,000 units. Again, that's across the US, but you could see Colorado is, along with 20 other states, are oversubscribed for low-income housing tax credit. So it means as a developer, what would normally or should normally take about 2 years to get a development from the time you've acquired land to opening your doors, it's taking about 4 years. that's the lag time.
That's helpful to know. And Shelley and Brian, I so appreciate both of you letting me call you to the front of the class without any advance warning on that. I want to start bringing everybody else in, recognizing that not everybody is in that particular space on the day-to-day. So I'm going to invite people to ask questions, whether they're of Shelley and Brian or questions you'd like us to probe into. And Shelley and Brian, as we come back around, I'd also love your thoughts, recognizing we'll be publishing recommendations at the end of this year. And we will either have seen the Senate take some action, or we'll be caught in a lame duck session after the election and going into some different administration or a continuation. So I'm going to want to pick your brains about, regardless of what happens with the feds, what we as a state might want to do to prepare to either leverage changes that come or to take action if they don't move forward on that. But Rochelle, I want to go to you first, and then Anais, just with your thoughts, if any, or questions that are coming to your mind as you listen to Shelley and Brian talking about some of these funding mechanisms and incentives.
Hi, thank you so much, Barrick. This is Rochelle, and I do have a question about, I'm familiar with the housing bills that are sitting within our state legislature right now, but does anybody know of anyone exploring? I know that it's very difficult, but there are some ways around some of the Tabor restrictions by specific bill and passing of legislation. Has that been, do we know if that's been explored at the state level of just about if there's a way to remove some of the Tabor restrictions around the incentivizations?
I am probably going to have to get legal on this to provide us some guidance. I know they have tried to address some narrow pieces of it, usually through ballot initiatives. But Shelley and Brian, I don't know if you have seen anything trying to get carve-outs around and addressing it as, for example, uses rather than taxes.
Yeah, Rochelle, this is Brian. That's a really good question. One of the ways that that the legislature is trying to get around some of the Tabor issues is by using tax credits. So not just like the affordable housing tax credit, but by sort of decreasing people's tax obligation on the front end, it decreases the Tabor surplus on the back end. So it's a way to not collect necessarily more money, but kind of anything Tabor related is going to have to go to the ballot, and and that's a hard proposition. Folks have been working on that for years and years and years to unwind Tabor a little, and it's people really appreciate getting that big fat check when they file their taxes. So
Thank you.
Yeah, Rochelle, this is Shelley, the only thing I would add is when we think about Proposition 123, I think that was another approach to look at how do you, because there have been, Housing Colorado for decades has really been trying to find a permanent revenue source for affordable housing. So Proposition 123, had passed, and that is really focused on affordable housing. But it brings a question like, is there ever, so it's affordable housing, but how do we ensure that it's not just that it's affordable housing for individuals that, that have a disability, or that, how do you do that carve out? And I don't think that's been specifically called out. So Barrick, I'm going back to, what do we want? What are we hoping to be able to write at the end of the year, or put in recommendations? It'd be just helpful to know what that looks like. I don't think there's any legislation that specifically calls that out that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Shelley. And I think that also highlights something, and our intention, as I shared at the last meeting, is to spend from now through the summer really getting smarter about these issues and trying to workshop the 10,000 foot view of the recommendations. And then we'll spend the late summer and into the fall digging more specifically into those recommendations. And Shelley, on something you just mentioned, I think something you all are going to have to wrestle with, and then the full task force will, is on something like a specific tax incentive or credit. Do you want to recommend something be explicitly and separately done to address affordable housing incentives for Coloradans with disabilities? Do you want to try to piggyback that on with broader efforts around affordable housing? Is it a yes and at what point are the efforts duplicative or competing? And I offer no opinion other than the opinion we're going to have to sort out. What are multiple strategies to make sure that this very real need gets addressed while a lot of other things are being contentious or contended with? Nice. Let me bring you in, and then Paul, and then Cassidy. Whether you have questions for Shelley or Brian, or questions that you want Carrie and I to get answers for, but when you've heard these basics about at the federal and the state level, the different programs that exist, what gears are turning for you?
Yeah, so many. I will admit I am very naive to this this background work that is required around funding and really what's possible. And I'm learning so much from you all just listening to the struggles of having to wait for legislation and this machine to start moving towards where we want it to head. And it's a really big machine with lots of drivers who want to go in different directions. And so I am trying to think outside the box because it seems like legislation is taking forever, long story short. And so the things that I down are more questions than direction, really. I'm curious about, so I don't know if you've all heard of the Aid to the Needy and Disabled Fund, which is an agreement between Social Security Administration and local government. So if a client or an individual is applying for Social Security, they can, through this agreement between the federal government and your local government, they can receive funds in the meantime until that Social Security goes through, right? And so what my naive brain goes to is, okay, so there are ways to do agreements on, let's say specific to disabilities, right? If you have SSI, if you are determined to be disabled and unable to work, right? These are the individuals that, we're really fighting for, at least the individuals that I support mostly. How do those agreements on housing? How do we allow that same kind of pipe to work with housing so that if someone is acknowledged to have Social Security, that there are ways that that federal and local level can interact, just like that cash program of Aid to Needy and Disabled. So that's a question I have. And then I have another question related to employer-assisted housing. It's something I've heard of before. Again, legislation seems like slow moving, and we also have a state that has so many has such economic wealth around certain aspects, right? So how do we incentivize employers, right, who have more freedom to choose what they do for their employees, who might be able to have incentives by having the state match funds? I'm reeling here. So I'm just curious about those two things, how that coordination between federal and local government can work with housing, and how employer-assisted housing looks like, if anybody has had experience with that. That's what's brewing up here.
I appreciate that. Paul, to you, and then to Cassidy, and then I'm going to push the thinking on this even some more when I look at the statewide picture. But Paul, what's coming to your mind from the architect?
Yeah, I don't have answers to what you were just saying. I'm going to come at this a little of a different direction because I'm probably the least into the financing, but I spend the money on making new housing. I know you asked this focused on rental housing. I just think I hope in a future date we talk about other components of housing as well, because if we force everybody into rental, we're forcing them to be exposed to inflation and never really get out of that trap.
And Paul, to be clear, let me just jump in, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't want to limit anybody's thinking to rental. I think
Yeah.
there's clear reasons that comes to the top, but as we talked to our last meeting, we should have all forms of homes
Yeah.
on our desk.
But I guess within the rental world, I love the comment about the oversubscription of the tax credits. I think it shows some of those limits. I guess my mind goes to kind of the broader concept of financing and affordability and those direct costs. So every $1,000, whatever, that finds its way into that unit not only raises that base rate, but it also reduces the quantity of projects that financially are feasible and actually happen. So, new development, 9%, I think is kind of the most typical, but let's think maybe about old motel or other conversions like that, or some of these office conversions. The more impacts they have that incur cost, it's going to not only increase those rents, but it's going to reduce the number of office buildings or motel conversions that happen. And so there will be fewer and fewer numbers that make its way. I think you're also asking like another type of housing, or think bigger, what scale. Denver Housing's Sun Valley site, I think is maybe one that comes to mind. That has site development components, and those 4 and 9% tax credits, I don't believe, help with that. They only help with the vertical construction within like that individual parcel, not the overall. And they're purposely not focusing one type of user into that neighborhood because of, a healthy, vital neighborhood has many populations, many types. So many financing vehicles, many paths forward, I think is important. The most effective levers to answer that, I think, in my opinion, they're performance or incentive based. So bonuses you can give in entitlements, extra density, expedited time, etc. Preference in tax credits or other financing competition. And maybe not just a scorecard, or if it, avoid the yes nos. Are you doing an extra 5% type A? No, but tell us what you're doing. All those tax credits were reviewed by a committee, as I understand it. And so they will be able to read the merits of all these different ideas and let people, bring their innovation to the table. And maybe a final comment is this idea of offsets. There's groups like the Home Builders Foundation and Homemade that do some great work. And maybe a certain developer, whatever, can't efficiently provide access provisions on the project they're working for, but they can make a donation to those groups that leverage that money and provide for greater access provisions, modifications, whatever, in housing and other manners.
Thank you. I think good things for us to be considering as we go forward. Cassidy, we're throwing a lot out at you, and I know you spend a lot of your time in the space, although not focused on the financing side of housing. What's coming to mind for you as you're hearing this conversation, and whether it's ideas, thoughts, or questions that it's surfacing for you?
Yeah, I have maybe a pretty basic question for the group, just to help me understand the players and the roles that they are playing. How much of like affordable housing developments are publicly versus privately owned? And I know that there's currently, I think it's House Bill 1175 that's trying to maybe give more I guess opportunity for local governments to purchase units or multifamily dwelling units or complexes to be used as affordable housing. So I'm just wondering like what the impacts are of this and legislation that could be like it, and hoping just for some insight on a real basic level about that.
Shelley or Brian, do you have thoughts there, or should Carrie and I take that as something to go dig into? Or both?
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind, Barrick, is, and everyone else is, when you think about rental housing, I do want to just say I agree with Paul's comments that we can't just look at rental housing. We do need to look at all types of housing. And when you're in this affordable housing space, there are, there are a handful of players that are doing for sale housing versus the rental housing. And on the rental housing side, I'll just say what really guides us when you think about low-income housing tax credits and when you get an award versus don't, CHAPA has guidelines to all developers, and it's called a qualified allocation plan. And it might be helpful for this group to look at what are some of those requirements when we think about accessibility, and, because that you get points if you are developing something that is meets one of the requirements. It could set your development aside from someone from another project that's up, and you have to go in front of CHAPA and you have to present your development and highlight what's unique and different about that. Who are you trying to serve, and how does that meet some of the requirements? So I think it may be helpful for us to look at, do a quick scan of the QAP to say, what are those requirements? I'm not trying to, as a developer, when there's so many requirements already, to say we want more restrictions and more challenges to make these deals possible. I'm not advocating for that, but if we were trying to look at, there is some requirements today around accessible and what that may look like. And then back to a prior conversation, maybe the first time we came together, when we talk about someone with a disability, it could be seeing, or it's it's non-seeing. So there are many developments that are being developed that are called permanent supportive housing that are serving individuals with a disability. And so being able to pull that data from the rental housing would also be helpful.
Thank you, Shelley. And later in today's conversation, we're going to start picking your brains a little more aggressively on what other stakeholders should we be learning from, whether it's as experts or to bring more personal and professional experiences. So that may mean talking with anybody from other additional developers, to talking with local and municipal folks, to obviously talking with people with lived experience. One thing I just wanted, on a point that you made, I'm looking at some of the data that I got, and to give people just a very quick high level picture. The estimate is, as I said at the top, 10.8% of Coloradans. Let me give some breakdown on this is again from the community survey of people self-identifying. But in terms of raw numbers of the type of disability that people self-identified, hearing disability is 198,000. Vision disability, 113,000, and I'll circulate all of this. Cognitive disability, 233,000. Ambulatory disability, 264,000. Self-care disability, 94,000. An independent living disability, 188,761. And when we look at where that is by age, as you might not be surprised, it tends to skew pretty heavily to older Coloradans. So we've got a couple of issues. Where I want to go next is we're going to pick up on all of these notes, and Shelley and Brian, we'll probably follow up with you two individually and pick your brains. What I want to ask, though, and I'll go to Brian, I'm going to go to you first since you spend time in the space, but I want everybody on the subcommittee to jump in. How, if at all, might we want to be thinking about incentivizing statewide? At the very top, I talked about what some of the numbers are in different counties. And if anybody wants to throw out anything, I can tell you, just scanning these numbers, we're talking in Weld County, for example, 34,381 people that self-identify as living with a disability. Pueblo County, 30,000. As a percentage, we've got some of these high counties like Los Alamos County, Huerfano County. Brian and Shelley, and then I'm going to go to everybody. What, if anything, might we want to put on the table to explore to ensure or to incent a developer to not just do so in the highest cost or the highest density areas? How can we drive some of this development of affordable housing to happen in some of our rural western slope and eastern counties?
Yeah. Can I interject before we move on?
Absolutely. Jump in.
Reading the 2023-2024 QAP, I don't see any provisions for accessible housing. So
thank you,
Thank you.
for flagging that and jumping in on it. Yeah. I think there's obviously one thing we're going to need to put on the table to discuss. Shelley, were you coming off
Yeah.
mute to address
Yeah,
that?
I was. Well, I mean, you asked what could what's going to incentivize that is really the financing, right? You can't get financing. So if what's going to score your application to get a 9%, a 4% tax credit is by doing developments, providing accessible housing in, whether it's in Weld County and Los Alamos, for Champa, and they do they do allocations across the state. So they do ensure that there is rule in every application. But, how can the QAP be that guide to ensure that where we have identified gaps, significant gaps of disabilities where and it could be for seniors or families or individuals, but how can the QAP help guide some of that? Because if you don't have financing, you can't really move forward with your developments without, this is rental housing development too, I want to call out. So that's one way. I think learning from Habitat, they're doing a lot around, with their housing. And so understanding how many of their housing units, for sale housing, are really accessible and what does that look like as part of their for sale housing development. I think Karen, she's on this committee, but not here today, but she'd be a good one to follow up with.
I was just looking for her, and we'll make sure that we connect with her. Brian, your thoughts. Are the QAP something we need to put on the table? Do we need to put on the table something that really looks at where we have disproportionate lack of inventory or need, or how do we drive this to where it's most needed, or to at least it being equitable across the state?
Sure. It's a really good question, Barrick. And I think I agree with Shelley that the financing mechanisms are probably the best place to go to, well, obviously, like, money is incentive, right? Money is a carrot. It should, that might be just kind of a given kind of statement, but how that money goes out the door, we can try and influence that process. Just, not only the tax credit financing, but also the financing and the resources that come out of the Division of Housing in the form of cash could also be a place where we think about trying to influence decision making. The QAP is hard because I say this officing in the Chaffa building, legislating the QAP is a really tricky, delicate kind of thing. There's ways to influence the QAP process, and there's a public input process to the development of the QAP, which happens every couple of years. But when legislators start to try and legislate that, and we saw this last year, funny enough, with a bill about pets in housing, it raised the hackles of folks in the affordable housing community broadly, but particularly with Chaffa folks when legislators started thinking about how to legislate the qualified allocation plan. The way that plan works is that, CHAFA receives public input. They write the QAP and it's signed by the governor. Um, and CHAFA's an interesting animal, not being an enterprise, not being a state agency. So like there's some technical kind of pieces to that, but certainly like, you know, I think that there are some avenues, rather than, making mandates, but there's some avenues for incentivizing, increasing the per door subsidy for um, uh, units that are created, whether they're type A, type B, or universal design. Like that could be something that gets legislated or directed by the state housing board or the governor. So there's some avenues there, but I agree with Shelley that the financing is really the carrot that we need to be looking at. And in terms of equity around the state, I think it's it's a hard nut to crack because every community is in need of more affordable housing, right? And with limited resources, like how do we distribute that equitably? And there was some effort um around, I believe it was House Bill 22-1304, in terms of some of the grant funding that went out the door with the federal ARPA money, that there's an attempt to do a more equitable distribution and do 50% of the grant funds would go to rural resort or rural communities and 50% would go to urban communities. So there's some precedent for trying to like spread the wealth, I guess is the way to say it. But knowing that the need is great everywhere it just makes it hard. It's just a dilemma that we face.
Yeah, I appreciate that candor. And I think, I know in the last 4 years, we've had two different state task forces on equitable distribution of grants. I think last session on issues like land use, we also saw, Brian, to your point, or picking up on something you mentioned, we've got a dynamic here in Colorado of local control. And so there's those things the state can do, and there's those things where it starts to reach that point of pushback. In the last kind of 5 to 8 minutes of this topic of conversation, I want to invite everybody in, and I'm going to suggest we need to be aspirational while having a little bit of a pragmatic and non-delusional end to that. And by that, I mean, I'm a big believer in puppy dogs and rainbows and unicorns. I also want to make sure we're developing ideas that can get done and that we're putting forward ideas that are practical given both the fiscal and political dynamics in Colorado right now. That said, Rochelle and then Cassidy and then Anais and then Paul, I would love your thoughts, and whether you want to be ultra wonky on this is the particular mechanism or just say this is what the outcome should be. And Barrick, you've got to get the other people to figure out how to get there. I want to welcome all ideas of how do we go from this system that is to what would you like to see happening? And then we can, in the next couple of conversations, bring in some people to talk to us about how to get there. But when you hear Brian and Shelley talking about, we're hoping that we've got the federal, we know what we've got in the state, that may double from 10 to 20 million. The QAPs are a sensitive thing to influence, but we know that there's needs across the state. What would you like to see us tackle?
Well, since I came off mute and I gave it the 3-second rule there, I'm going to ask that I very much appreciate Shelley's point and Brian driving it home on the financial incentives. And I would love for there to be, from what I understand from property owners, and we know that Atlantis Community Center went through this when they developed their housing community here in Denver, that the process itself was extremely difficult, and any kind of incentivization we can put around subject matter experts or pairing with the 9 centers for independent living or the Office for Independent Living or the Disability Office for the state could fast track or prioritize somebody receiving tax incentives, or if there's some other intrinsic, or I guess that would be an extrinsic value to that, that if a developer could be proven to show that they had some sort of subject matter expert pairing or partnership with an agency that is an expert in housing, affordable housing, and specifically around accessible affordable housing, then perhaps they receive an extra incentive, or they're, put at the front of the pack, or they have a streamlined system to apply so that it could fast track their project. I mean, construction time is money, right? So anything that could put them to the front of the line if they were proven to pair with another state agency that's an expert in the area. That's my rainbows and butterfly dream.
I'm a big believer that we've got to start there rather than start with the minimus. Anais, your thought, and then Paul.
Yeah, I would second that 100% of just not just to show that there is an expert in the field of disabilities and match that with a developer to kind of bump them up the list, but because that will inform things a little bit better. I think often, we reach force, or we do a lot of force of let's just do more housing, more this, more that, without really being reflective on what that means. So I love that idea, not just for financial strategy, but just to make it so that it's actually implemented in a way that is helpful for our clients. And that's also where I'm at. It just kind of seems like there has to be a number of different avenues and sectors that come to the table in order for us to kind of move forward and utilize all the different buckets that each of these sectors might have. And so that's my wish and dream, is to be able to bridge some of these sectors that are, for the clients that I work with, I see it from that, sky view of, oh, you're dealing with this, and this sector, right? But they're not necessarily communicating. They're not necessarily communicating with each other. And so I would love to have more intersector communication overall, not just as a financial strategy, but just as an implementation strategy as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul, and then Cassidy, I'm not sure if you're still with us. I hope so. Paul, your thoughts on end state and what we should be trying to accomplish, or any levers that you have come to mind that you're hearing.
A few random ones here. Rochelle's idea of the subject matter expert. Maybe there's plans reviewers, whether it's on the building department review or the zoning review, that offers optional comments that could easily be win-win. Hey, so-and-so, if you do this, doesn't incur extra cost, and you can really affect that population. Another topic is trying to tie to the value of the home, or make these things maybe more front of mind. Somebody I know well suggests maybe every home needs a HERS score when they go for resale. And what a HERS score does is it scores how energy efficient your home is. And if I knew that I'm choosing between 3 homes and they all had a score, I could make an informed decision on which one would be better. Maybe there's a way that we could weave access into that too. And maybe once you start scoring it, you can give it benefits or discounts with property taxes, because that could be tied to your appraisal. A program on the multifamily front that seems to have a lot of traction amongst our clients is the Green Certification Finance Discount Program. I don't know its formal name, but if you get a green certification for your program or project saying that it meets certain sustainability targets, you get a 50 BIP discount on your interest. But if there was a similar thing, if you achieve these targets, you get a discount, that would have really broad appeal, I would assume. I guess specific to your kind of question about like Los Animas County or some of those jurisdictions, I've never been to Los Animas County, but my biased assumption is that it's maybe less affluent, more elderly, and more existing housing, not necessarily as much new development. And so a small scale improvement program that might have more effect on those populations. So what I'm thinking is like low flow shower heads and fluorescent or LED light bulbs that you could get for free or for little charge. Are there little improvements that we can incentivize that improve access, whether it's ramps or showers modification that are kind of lower costs, strobes or alarms that you just kind of like a Ring doorbell system that has some of those bells and whistles. Or on the multifamily front, tactile signage or more easily approachable signage, mailbox modifications, just some of these things that may not check every box, but can make a lot of impact in maybe counties like what I think Los Animas is.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm not intending to pick on Los Animas County. It was just one that jumped out at me. I also think, you bring up, I think, some interesting points about the age of homes and what's available there. I don't know how many of you just saw there was an article in Westword about Ordway that went from a desolate town to a cannabis boom town where all of these companies were part of the green rush. And now they're calling it America's first cannabis ghost town because everybody left. And there's now hundreds of empty warehouses and buildings and single family homes just sitting there. So I think that's another critical thing we're going to have to think about is not just where can we go build some steel or brick building, but what is the character and the context in each of these. Cassidy's having some internet problems, so I'm not going to pick on her. Shelley and Brian, before I bring us to a totally different topic to kind of wrap up, your thoughts on what you're hearing today and anything that it's raising for you, either that new thinking for you or stuff that you're saying, hey, this reminds me we need to talk about these other issues.
Well, I would say for me, I think what would be really helpful for this group or to be able to get some data from CHAPA, I really like the ideas that Paul had shared around, the incentives around green build or, the more, energy efficiency you create with new development, there are some additional resources you can tap into. And so is that at the state level that would support development across the state? So those are very, I think, great approaches to as we think about what how we serve low income residents of Colorado. I have been to Los Animas County, and I had family, my grandmother who lived in Los Animas County, and I just want to make this point. She was blind, and she lived the infrastructure in Los Animas County, and most of the communities there is no infrastructure. And so watching someone having to navigate on a gravel road and you're not able to see in front of you. So the conversation, it's like it goes to a different direction for me of like, it's more than just building, you can have a ramp and everything, but if you don't have the accessibility to streets to, it makes it, people become they become isolated in their own home because they're not able to get out. So I've drove the community there and, it's eye-opening and so that comes to mind for me. And sorry to go there on a personal level, but I'm just, that's what we're talking about. If like, someone that is living in a community where there may be 500 people and you don't have access to the same resources that we do in the Metro Denver area or in any community you might live in. And so I think we just have to be mindful of that when we talk about, our rural areas versus the urban areas, like the needs look very different. So it's not just housing, it's also the accessibility, the infrastructure, and so much more. But I did also hear from the executive committee, that's not what we're being charged with, right? It was really coming with recommendations like, okay, you're not being asked to solve for that. So I also want to be mindful of that, but you can't bring that up without knowing there are other challenges that underlie that.
I appreciate that. And let me be clear with this group. We do have statutory requirements that are what is the inventory, what is the need, what is the projected need, and what is the financing. But I'm going to facilitate these conversations in a way that every topic is a floor, not a ceiling. And by that, I mean anything we talk about is the minimum. You all have, and it's been multiple people on the subcommittee have raised the point, Shelley, that you are, that just because you put a wonderfully accessible unit in the middle of a town that has no sidewalks, no transportation, and no paved roads doesn't mean you've actually accomplished a whole lot. So while I'm going to drive the conversations to first tackle what we have to, I welcome and invite all of you to push the thinking, to make the recommendations. And I want to be open that we may get to July or August and say, we've made pretty solid recommendations in these 6 areas. We still think these other areas need more exploration and conversation, and that's an option. So, Shelley, yes, we had a little bit of pushback. I will make sure we meet what we are statutorily required, but I want everybody here to push the envelope. Colorado is better than doing the bare minimum.
Well, thank you for that. And I'll just add something then with that thought. When we think about our rural communities, I'd love to overlay that with if we know the aging, the population, if it's an aging population, maybe some of the resources that could be valuable to some of our rural communities where they own their home is having access to ramps and, just some of the other resources that Paul had referenced. And that could be in addition to, not only housing for individuals or persons with disability, but how do you keep folks that have a disability housed?
So, Brian, I'm going to go to you next, but I'm going to adjust my question a little bit because I'm watching the clock as well. The 2 questions I still need to get with this group are picking up where Shelley was of what data do we need to have these informed conversations? And then my second question for everybody is going to be, who do we need to listen to? And whether that's an experts, whether that's a sector of folks, or whether that's people with lived experiences. But on the question of data, Shelley, what I do have, and I will confess, it came in literally as the call was starting, so I've got to dig through it more. I've got the breakdown of persons with disabilities by county as self-reported. I've got the aggregated data of how many people with different types of disabilities. I don't know yet if I've got that by county. And by that, I mean, it breaks down how many people have a visual impairment statewide and how many people have any disability in a county. But I'm going to have to dig into that more. What I don't know that we have is any data on the available units. And I'm sharing that because we'll get this all to you. But I'm going to go to Brian and then to Rochelle, because I see your hand up, Rochelle, with the question of what data, and let's keep it focused for now on, screw it, let's go broad. What data would be most helpful when you're thinking about today's conversation, as well as the broader conversation on inventory and need? Brian, to you, and then to Rochelle.
Yeah, I think I'm always thinking of like the delta between what is and what should be, and what that gap is, because within that gap is where we can talk about like cost analysis. We can talk about, a whole bunch of other data needs. We can sort of plug more easily available information into that space. So I know that that's just gonna be awfully hard to put our finger on. But I think, in terms of folks to talk to, I really want to talk with like the folks who are in my membership. And when I think about like the membership of Housing Colorado, we're talking about everybody from contractors and architects to frontline service providers and tax accountants. I really want to get and listen to their perspective on a whole wide range of issues. Partially because, like, just selfishly, I need to understand that as the executive director of my organization. But I think there's a wealth of knowledge out there too. And in terms of like, one that I think of is just like, what is the difference in cost of um building two different unit types? What is there a number that we can hold on to? Because from there we can make recommendations on how to kind of even that out. So that's what I'm thinking about right now. But that delta is going to be an important one.
Got it. Appreciate that. Rochelle, to you, and then I'm going to share a little bit for folks about the two types of listening opportunities we'll have and pick brains a little bit more. But Rochelle, data or perspectives? What are you thinking?
Thanks, Barrick. I did want to ask a question regarding the data that you said you received it from. Where did you say that you received it? What is the source for that information? Was that census information from the demographer's office?
It was a community survey, American Community Survey data that we got from demographer's office, I believe.
From the demographer's office, which is, I'm thinking it's a couple of years old.
It is 2021. Yes.
Yeah. I would recommend that we maybe ask for is the Office for Independent Living keeps a metrics committee readily available to the demographer's office to inform them with some a bit more timely data. We've seen a dramatic increase in the last year, and we are estimating it at almost 800% of people in housing crisis for people with disabilities. It's dramatic. It's some of the same information that the Colorado Homeless Coalition has come out with recently. Also, another probably better, or I wouldn't say better, would say more recent collector of data. I say that only because the data that we looked at a couple of years ago is so drastically different than what we're looking at currently and what we're experiencing on kind of boots on the ground currently. That gives me pause. I would want us to have the most critical data in front of us. We've also been adding, when we say people that are recognized peoples with disabilities, we usually traditionally have added 10% to that. That either allows us to add the aging population, which we're all the aging population. I'm sitting here aging, but it allows us to automatically add kind of almost an attrition rate. What's the opposite of attrition? Contrition. The added amount of people that regularly come into the disability community due to some sort of health condition or aging process. So that is the amount that we add regularly per year. Those are amounts we give to the JBC to justify our budget on a regular basis. So just kind of adding that to the conversation that the problem is large. I do love to go with that data. Like you said, it is hard to get our heads wrapped around that. As Brian stated, I would really like some more information from those subject matter experts that we're talking about, that like those comparisons of unit costs, when in comparison to each other. Those are areas I don't have a lot of background on. We do, to Paul's point earlier, I love that you suggested the type of HER score thought process to it. Without knowing any better, we've kind of come up with something like that within Weld and Morgan and Logan counties, just to give an assessment of properties that are available for Section 8 housing vouchers when they come available to us. And we kind of have a 1 through 5 score, very simplified score of what is an accessible property. If it's got an accessible roll-in shower, if it's on a ground level, it's a super simple scoring system. So I would love more insight into if there's anybody who has anything similar, but I think that's an absolutely brilliant idea. We just came up with it as a resource out of necessity, but I could see it being flipped on its head and used as something as an incentive. So I would love to kind of delve into that a little bit more. I don't know if I totally answered your question though, Barrick.
You answered my question, and I think you highlighted a number of important facts. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate you putting a spotlight that the data, and if I'm correct, 2021 data probably is about a 4 or 5 year look back. So it's probably looking at data that spans going back to 2017, maybe even 16, and that 5 year window. And I think we know a whole lot has changed in terms of both our population and the economic conditions. So I'm glad you flagged that. We've got about 3 more minutes before I want to make my ask to close it out. Anais, Paul, anything you want to jump in with on thoughts of data? Not yet. Okay. Paul?
I think it'll repeat something I've said before, but I'm just really guarded by hearing, oh, it's 10%, and fearing that that's going to lead to we need 10% type A units. Because I don't think that's appropriate way to respond to that data number, because it's whether it's the different type of disabilities or the different type of housing that those people are in, it has to be parsed apart. Like the easy answer is what it isn't. 10% type A in a new apartment doesn't generally mean populations over 50 that are lower income. And so they're connecting that mismatch with the data is what I would look for.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate both you and Rochelle and everybody pushing to make sure we're getting data that is not trying to put a certain shade through which we're looking at things, and that we're not looking to do the bare minimum. I will also just tease for our future conversation. We're talking today about percentage of homes that qualify for this funding and that are affordable. The other side of this equation obviously is accessible units. And one of the task force members who does some development and has been supporting us in planning for this subcommittee, he is disabled physically, ambulatory, and he highlighted that he went to buy a condo in one of our mountain towns, and they had a certain number of units that were accessible, and one of them had the best view. So they sold one to somebody who didn't have the need for it, but they developed the unit that was necessary, leaving none available for this individual. So we're going to need to have conversations if you all want to make recommendations, both on the financing side and how these accessible units are handled once they're built. We're at 4:25, and I don't want to take us past time. My other big area of questions, and so what I'm going to do is ask Carrie to work with me to follow up with all of you, probably through a very simple Google form. We've talked to you in the past about Engage Dora, which is a platform Dora has put together, and the state has, to solicit input. And we can let people, submit written stories and perspectives. They can upload documents. We can also do things like surveys. One of the things that we'd like to identify, in addition to the experts and the data that you all want to hear from, and I'll follow up in the form about this as well, but what are specific questions that you would like to put before different groups of stakeholders? Whether that's questions you have for developers, questions you have for Coloradans living with disabilities, questions you have for local government officials. So we'll send you out and ask for just, are there 2 or 3 specific questions you would like to ask different groups of stakeholders that would help inform your conversations? Separately from that, I'll ask, who would you like to directly hear from? Whether that's a presentation, a panel, materials. But those 2 different things of what experts do we want to hear from, and what stakeholders or people with different expertise and lived experiences would you like to get specific questions in front of? So we'll follow up with you on all of that. And I will just name and thank Carrie. She's been off screen because she is at the tail end of week 2 of COVID. I can't get her to take a day off, but she has been toiling through this and taking notes. So Carrie, I appreciate you being with us. I know we all wish we could both see and hear you, but understand. So Carrie's been furiously taking notes, both live and with her AI note taker. So we'll capture all of this and get back to you with some of what we captured today. I'll follow up with those questions of the data, the professional perspectives, and specific questions that we may want to ask stakeholders. In the last 2 or 3 minutes before I let us go, anybody have any final thoughts or questions though? Then I will do what I rarely get to do and end something a few minutes ahead, give you a few minutes of your day back. Thank you all for continuing to just give your time so generously to this work. If anything comes to mind between now and when you hear from us, don't hesitate to call, email, or text me or Carrie, and we'll follow up by email sometime next week. But thank you all for today's conversation.
Thank you.